The message which comes out of the presentation that I will share with you, that Asia-Pacific economies are indeed getting affected very significantly from the global downturn, the second stage of it, and the channels of transmission are the same which affected Asia-Pacific in the 2008-9, the trade and finance, and the measures that developed countries are adopting to address their own problems, for instance, through injection of liquidity, etc., are going to create further challenges for the region. And the Asia-Pacific economies, I mean, the way forward for them is to gradually rebalance themselves in favor of greater domestic and regional demand. The point has been made in the morning in a couple of presentations, and so this is very particularly relevant for Asia-Pacific. Now, I won't spend any time on this. Actually, we have heard quite a bit of discussion since morning on how the advanced economies of the world have got into, after a relatively V-shaped kind of recovery in 2010, in 2011 again got into a mess, and the risks of a double-dip recession have not receded. But what is worrisome is that the remedies or policy space that they had in 2008-9, when the first phase of crisis was happening, is not there anymore. I mean, at that time they could roll out massive fiscal stimulus programs, and they could lower policy rates in the monetary side. But today, because of the buildup of debt, in fact, they are actually pursuing austerity programs, and the policy space for monetary easing is simply not there because interest rates are already close to zero. So they are in a situation of liquidity trap, and the impact on Asian economies is beginning to be felt. I mean, there was a reference made to how the shortened capital flows to which emerging economies of Asia Pacific are exposed to, that fled the region, and that brought down the capital markets all across the region. And so that was the first channel. The outflow of capital was the first channel of impact. Then slowing economies in the advanced world have also affected the export demand, growth rate of export demand for Asian economies. And then you see that is going down from, say, in the past quarters, we have seen it going down from 29% to 19%. So obviously, the economies which are highly export dependent have been affected more, and so signs of slowing down of Asia-Pacific economies are very visible, especially for those economies that are highly dependent upon exports. The SCAP projections for 2011 and 12. 2011 also, when we did this year-end update of our economic and social survey of Asia and Pacific, which comes out in April, May. So we revised the estimates which we present towards the end of the year, and we issue a year-end update. We already downgraded some of these forecasts which we had made earlier in April, May. And in December, we lowered them marginally from what we had said in April, May. But for 2012, it shows a significant decline from 7.2% for 2011 to 6.6%. And for specific economies, China, for instance, goes down from 9.3% to 8.5%, and like that for different economies. I won't spend time on that, but it's in the presentation. But despite this slowdown, of course, the Asia Pacific on the whole remains the most dynamic region in the world because of the the very still robust growth rates of large economies like China and India. But then other pressures have been there, and inflation became a very important concern or challenge in 2000, October 2010 onwards, especially because of rising food and commodity prices. And although the outlook for inflation is improving or moderating in 2012, but the volatility of commodity prices continues to remain high. On the whole, despite the slowdown of the world economy, the commodity prices continue to remain high, and the volatility is on top of that, and that is a problem. So the other, now going to the policy challenges side, of course, at this moment, the greatest policy challenge for Asia-Pacific economies, like anywhere else, is to revive the momentum for growth. And for that, of course, there is a considerable policy space in terms of fiscal policy and monetary policy in Asia-Pacific economies because of their relatively low levels of public debt. And the latest issue of economists actually has an index of how much room to maneuver different economies have in this phase of this crisis. And you find many Asian economies listed in the bottom of that chart that economist has in terms of having larger policy room or space for maneuver to deal with the crisis. And, to the extent the inflation is not a big concern, and in most economies it's subsiding, that space should be used. And I'll come back to that for what could be the the priorities for using that policy space. The monetary policy was tightened as the economies were facing inflationary threats or inflationary expectations in the course of last year. Now that can be also reversed as the threat of inflation is coming down. The other is a continuing challenge that Asia-Pacific economies are facing is to deal with or cope with the volatile capital flows. And as the developed economies or advanced economies deal with the crisis through further quantitative easing, this problem will be even becoming more serious. And of course, in the course of last year, a number of Asia-Pacific economies did go for resort to capital controls, including countries like Republic of Korea, Indonesia, Thailand. And I think this is something and which has been raised in the morning, and Martin also, Ilma has also raised that. I think a number of Asian economies need to consider or could consider using one type or the other types of capital controls to moderate the volatility of these short-term capital flows. The other is the very important challenge of rebalancing the economies from external dependence to more domestic and regional dependence. And this is a point which has come out in many presentations in the morning. Ilma's, Mr. Somavia, Professor Deepak Nair himself, the chair, that rebalancing has to be done. And for that, again, there is a lot of space in the sense that, the East Asian economies need to increase consumption, and the Southeast Asian economies increasing investment where, it has declined over time. And on the whole, Asia-Pacific region, because there is a very large segment of people living in poverty, and there are many development gaps in terms of infrastructure or other social achievements, there is a very large space for increasing aggregate demand, because we will never get back to the business as usual kind of scenario that existed before the crisis in terms of developed economies acting as a locomotive of growth. And the policies that need to be pursued to unleash the potential of aggregate demand generation in Asia-Pacific region include paying attention to agriculture productivity and rural development, MDG achievements, basic services and infrastructure, job-oriented growth, which was emphasized a lot in the morning by Mr. Juan Somavia, social protection, again, which was very much emphasized by Mr. Chairman and Mr. Somavia, financial inclusion, and all different things that go along with that. The other thing which we have been emphasizing a lot at SCAP is to exploit the potential of regional economic integration in Asia Pacific. One finds that the intra-regional trade share has gone up because of intra-regional trade growing much faster than the total trade of Asia-Pacific economies. And in just between 1993 to 2009, if you see, despite the blip during the East Asian crisis, it has gone up from, say, 49% to 54%. But the potential, if you estimate it through a gravity model, you find it is much, much higher. And the other thing which comes out of the recent analysis that we did at SCAP was that there are complementarities within subregions of Asia, and there are complementarities between subregions of Asia. And the interesting point is that the complementarities between subregions of Asia, like South Asia, Southeast Asia, Pacific, Central Asia. So the complementarities between subregions are greater than the complementarities within the subregions. The approach so far adopted by Asia-Pacific economies is generally focused on exploiting the potential of the sub-regional complementarities. The potential of regional cooperation in exploiting the synergies or complementarities that exist between the subregions has not been attempted. And so the time has come when we need to consolidate the subregional groupings, but also build a framework which can facilitate exploitation of synergies between the subregions, like between South Asia and Southeast Asia, or between South Asia and Central Asia, and between, so all different 5 subregions of Asia-Pacific region. So there is a case for building a broader regional architecture for regional cooperation. And finally, recycling Asian foreign exchange reserves for closing infrastructure gaps. There are very wide infrastructure gaps in Asia-Pacific economies. If you see this chart, it provides you an SCAP index of infrastructure gaps. I mean, infrastructure could be roads or rails, or depending upon which sector you are looking at. This index captures all the infrastructure segments into one single index, and then gives you scores for the relative rankings of different Asian economies. And you find that between Singapore, which has the best infrastructure in Asia-Pacific, or Japan for that matter, and the other end of the spectrum, where least developed countries like Papua New Guinea, Nepal, Lao PDR, or Solomon, there is a very wide gap that need to be closed. And for closing that, you need huge amount of resources. But fortunately, Asia-Pacific economies today have foreign exchange reserves of more than $5 trillion. But the regional financial architecture doesn't allow it to be redeployed within Asia. And it is put generally in the Western capital markets, generally in US Treasury bonds, because central banks are averse to taking risks, and they try to put it in AAA rated securities, which are generally to be found in the Western economies. So the point is that we need to develop regional financial architecture beyond Chiang Mai Initiative, which was referred to this morning, to create a mechanism which can mobilize part of these reserves for infrastructure financing. And this is something which we are trying to do at SCAP. Now, finally, to sum up, I think the message is very clear that the second stage of crisis is affecting economies in the Asia-Pacific region significantly. They have the challenge to manage the growth and inflation balance and cope with the volatile capital flows, there is a fiscal space and monetary space which is available, but should be used to rebalance the economies in favor of domestic consumption and investment by pursuing inclusive policies, and then fostering regional economic integration and building a regional financial architecture to facilitate recycling of their foreign exchange reserves for infrastructure gaps closing could be some possible options for the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kumar, for the brevity and clarity. The Asia-Pacific region retains the dynamism of economic growth in spite of the crisis of the past and possibly in spite of the crisis to come. But with the good news, with the highlights, there are also shadows. There are divergences in development within the Asia-Pacific region that there is much to be done in terms of inclusion, because there is an exclusion of values that are not equal. But you have presented concrete, constructive suggestions on how Asia might do better in terms of exploiting complementarities, in terms of recycling reserves, in terms of trying to rebalance the Asia-Pacific economy. Thank you. I'd now like to invite LIM Mah Hui to make his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and wish to thank the South Centre for inviting me to share some thoughts to the distinguished audience here. I guess we have heard rich analysis whole of this morning and part of this afternoon, and I guess it makes my presentation both more difficult and easier. More difficult because it's difficult to come up with many new bright ideas, and easier because then perhaps I can be quite brief, right? So the outline is basically the major risk facing Asia, the economic impacts, and then the mitigating policies, short-term as well as long-term. Okay, as we have heard before, the major risks are problem?
I make it full screen.
Oh. Okay, thanks. First, the slowdown of growth in the US and the euro recession, a possible euro recession. And I put there as a question, perhaps, is there a possibility of a hard landing in China? And given the fact that China, as according to accuse, is about the only locomotive in the developing countries that can play any positive and important role, this would have a major impact, if there were a hard landing in China. And another risk of facing the developing worlds are the volatility in the commodity markets, mainly from, I think, excess liquidity, financialization of the commodity markets, and the unforeseeable geopolitical risk. And on the financialization of the commodity markets and its impact on commodity prices, I think the UNTAC put out an excellent report last year, on this whole issue. Another major risk, I think, that could happen is if another financial crisis could really erupt from large bank exposures to sovereign debt in Europe, leading to some banking bankruptcies of large banks in Europe. That would really have a real major ripple effect on the rest of the world. Okay? And finally, the risk, the unknown consequences, or what sometimes I call the unknown unknowns, from the non-traditional monetary policies from the advanced economies. We have quantitative easing. You have now European central banks, directly financing banks. They are actually more interested in bailing out banks than in bailing out the economies. And like the quantitative easing, leading to inflationary pressures, not only in Asia, particularly in asset inflation, but also imported, I think, inflationary pressures within the United States. So with this kind of a non-traditional methods that are being tried out, we do not know what kind of consequences may face us. What are the economic effects on Asia? As Nagesh has pointed out, basically sharp drop in exports, since at least 2/3 of our exports in Asia go to the G3, slowing growth, employment losses, and poverty. And I think this is a very important one, is the vulnerability in the household balance sheet, particularly in some of these countries, like in Malaysia, perhaps Philippines and Korea. In Malaysia, the household debt to GDP is around 75%. In US, if you remember, it's around 100%, although it's come down to probably about in the 90s. However, the central banks, I think, are pretty good at obfuscating figures, because I think the more important indicators of household balance sheet health is not household balance sheet to GDP, but household debt to disposable income, because that's a direct relationship. Okay, how much disposable income do you have to service your household debt? And in Malaysia, it's one of the highest in the world at 140%. And in terms of the debt service, the household debt to household debt service is around 50% of the household disposable income are used to service household debt, mainly arising from huge loan payments to cars and to houses. Okay? And I think this is a very vulnerable problem for some of the countries. The other one is, of course, asset inflation from continued excess liquidity. We saw that in China. We see that in Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia. Okay? And I think this is a major problem. And another effect is we have seen, because of the problems in the European banks, there's a withdrawal of credit. And there could be, therefore, a shift in the composition of the investment flows from the more productive type of investments, like a bank credit, trade finance, and all that, to more speculative investments, essentially equity, and to the property investments. Okay. So what are the mitigating policies? Short terms, I think you just have a limited amount of options you have. Basically, the usual monetary loosening, expensive fiscal policy, but countries with high fiscal deficit or current account deficits have less space. For example, Malaysia. Malaysia has been suffering from fiscal account deficits of around 4 to 6% of its GDP for the last almost 10 years, with 1 or 2 years of surplus. And India has the current account deficits, and Philippines too, I think is one country where its fiscal debt is quite high. However, I think, one thing that the countries should keep the whole range of policy options open, including, as what the ARCUS has talked about today, the whole question of, how do you control capital inflows as well as outflows, not as a policy option of the last resort, but as a normal policy option that they should be able to undertake. Now I go to basically more the long term, I think, which is much more interesting, because the present economic crisis is also a crisis of capitalism. As Financial Times has been running, what you call a series of debates and articles of this. Of course, the major thrust there is how do you repair this capitalism, rather than is there an alternative? And it's a crisis of the free market ideology. And like all crises, it offers a good opportunity for us to redefine the economic paradigm and the economic debate. And I think people from the South, should take up that cudgel, particularly since there is also a rebalancing of economic power, from the advanced economies to the emerging markets, although of course ARCUs may have a slightly different take on this. In particular, I think the issue we have to talk about is the type and the quality of growth rather than growth for the sake of growth, and the role of the state, which Mr. Chairman talked about this morning. I just want to talk about 4 major lessons from the ongoing financial crisis and what do we do. The first is that in Asia, which has been driven, the growth has been driven basically by exports. We now see that there is a limit to export-led growth. Export-led growth is necessary, in initial stages, and probably good, as we see in most of the Asian economies, either from Japan or the tigers and all that. But beyond a certain level, it becomes counterproductive. It doesn't make sense to continuously accumulate foreign exchange reserves, beyond level like in China, which is $3 trillion. It just basically means that we, the poor countries, are essentially funding the consumption and investments of the advanced economies. And it is due to the fact that either we save too much, as in the case of China, where the saving rate is around 50% of GDP, or the investment rates are too low, as in the case of Malaysia, where the investment rates are something around 20%, of which half of it is basically public investments, and private investments is only something around 10%. Whereas the savings rate in Malaysia is essentially around 35%, okay? Of which, as I said, 20% is investment, of which half is only private investment. That means locally, our investors are simply shipping their money abroad. And I think there was a recent report that showed that Malaysia is one of those countries with the highest amount of illicit outflow of capital. Okay. And that, as we stated earlier, many speakers have talked about the need to reorient it to domestic growth or to intra-regional trade. But then, domestic growth consumption is constrained by the lack of domestic consumption. As in the case of China, it's 35%, and in Singapore, it's around 40% of GDP. And this is essentially related to the falling share of GDP accruing to labor and the rising share of GDP to capital over the last 20 years. And this issue, is what I would call the second imbalance in the whole financial crisis. Because I think there are 3 major imbalances, which is the current account imbalance, which we talked about. The second is the imbalance between, or inequality of the imbalance between GDP share to labor versus GDP share to capital. Okay? And various people have talked about it. Stephen Roach has talked about it. And Warren Buffett recently was quoted in the one of the last year's article in Foreign Affairs, where he says that that there has been a class warfare going on in America for the last 20 years, and what is happening is that the rich has been winning this class warfare hands down, right? And we see that in China, where the share of labor share of GDP dropped from about 57% to 37% between 1997 to 2005, and around the same time, consumption fell from 55% to 35%. And this is not happening only in China. It's almost throughout the world. In Japan, Canada, and 12 European countries, labor share fell from 56% to 53.7% between 2001 and 2006. And as I said, Stephen Roach calls this, in the last 20 years, the economic pendulum has swung from labor to capital, and that this, trend is not sustainable without severe political consequences. Now, this imbalance is essentially caused by wage repression. That is, wages are lagging behind productivity. In China, labor productivity increased 179%, while wages rose 92% between 2000 and 2007. All right? And we see this in this graph. The blue line, dotted one, is increase in labor productivity, whereas the green line is the increase in real wage index between 1998 to 2010. The same trend you see in United States, except that this is a longer period, between 1947 to 2008. Okay? The blue line is the productivity per hour, and the purple line is the compensation per hour. Between 1947 to 1975, those two went hand in hand, in tandem, and that is what should be the case, and what is prescribed in marginal productivity theory in economics. But after 1975, there's a clear divergence, and that divergence has not, been corrected. Okay. Okay. So essentially, the trickle-down theory of growth. That is, you can have growth, but then the benefits will trickle down to the lower classes and all that. It's not acceptable anymore. The government, I think, here must play a role to ensure that wages must keep up with productivity increases. I think the state has to play an important role, through various measures. Okay, and here I want to stress that the practice of countries, particularly in the developing countries, competing to attract foreign direct investments by repressing wages and offering all other kinds of incentives is basically a race to the bottom, and this should be replaced by some kind of a coordination to address this problem. We're not going to help ourselves by telling the world that we have the cheapest labor in the world, and that you can come in and exploit our labor, because it comes back to this whole question of inequality and lack of domestic consumption. If you want to promote domestic consumption, you can't do it at the same time by repressing wages. And the third thing, as Nagesh is talking about, regional cooperation, I think it's become much more important simply because of the unwillingness of major advanced countries to institute any meaningful reforms in the international financial architecture. Speaking as an ex-banker, I don't see really any political will or economic will to make any major political reforms, financial reforms in the international financial architecture. And to that extent, as an interim step, that the the regional groupings must get their act together to do something, to do the heavy weight lifting, among themselves. Okay, and you have regional cooperation in trade, and I think in capital controls as to what types of investments to encourage and what types to discourage, and cooperation in industrial policy. And to this extent, I think Asia, perhaps among the other continents, ex-Europe, are probably quite ahead in terms of talking about regional cooperation and integration, as has been talked about earlier, the Chiang Mai Initiative, which is basically an international liquidity fund of about 120 billion that countries within Asia can dip into during times of crisis, although there are a lot of problems, shortcomings. For one, the fund is not big enough, it's only 120 billion. Secondly, that only 20% of the funds, if you dip into, are without IMF conditionalities. 80% are still with IMF conditionalities. And to that extent, therefore, no Asian countries has actually used it, even though it came into being about 10 years ago. Okay. And the other thing is that Asian governments, particularly under ADB, Asian Development Bank, are pushing for greater financial integration. But I think their strategy is pretty lopsided, one-sided. That is, essentially, they are pushing for deepening the capital markets, the stock market, and more so the bond markets, right? And I think there are major risks involved in the development of capital markets, not least among which is the fact that it is very speculative and very destabilizing. And that I think Asia should look at, other ways, not necessarily as substitutes, but complementary ways of mobilizing Asian reserves And essentially, we're talking about more long-term credit banks and development banks. And this is one of the papers that I think UNTAC is, and the South Center is working on. Finally, enhancing the role of the state in industrial policy, in regulating and reconfiguring finance so that it serves the real economy rather than to promote the Anglo-American model of speculative finance. And to play an important role in increasing social consumption goods, health, education, public transportation, I think that's very important, clean energy. Some of this can be done in partnership with the private sector, rather than just simply talking about when we want to reorientate towards domestic consumption. It would be disastrous if we're talking about consumption of private goods such as cars. That I think is not a sustainable, ecologically step. In fact, then what the government should do is to use market methods, taxation, cross subsidies, and all that to basically reduce private consumption of private goods that are I think not very ecologically sustainable, to tax them and to use that subsidy to fund things like public transport. This type of social goods, I think, are much more important than just simply, increasing domestic consumption of luxury goods and all that. I think with this, I'd like to just end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Malik, for that very, very clear, comprehensive presentation about the dangers for Asia, the lessons for Asia. I'd now like to invite Dr. Alfredo Calcagno to make his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wish to thank the South Center, Martin Coa and Manuel Montes, for the kind invitation. This is it? No.
Just close it.
Yes, and this is not only protocolar, because really the fact of preparing this presentation led me to put together a lot of numbers that I knew but never saw all together about Latin America, and this made me a bit more confident about my region. I'm from Latin America, even if I cannot be optimistic for the whole world economy. Because, well, one important question for answering, one important point for answering this question, how a new global downturn may affect Latin America, has to do with the situation of the region. Then I will mention basically three things. One is the size and nature of the economic downturn, then the economic situation of the region, and finally the policies that can be followed. This is a bit like if we had to answer which will be the cause, the consequences, the destruction of an earthquake. First, which is the size of the earthquake? How big is the shock? And then where it happened, in a country that is used to earthquake and have the buildings prepared for that, or in a country that is not used for and is not prepared for. And this has been then the first two issues that I wanted to see. I am using here what was prepared by a joint venture in the United Nations with DESA in New York, the regional commissions, and UNCTAD, which is the World Economic Situation and Perspective and Prospects, that was launched in January, and basically shows three scenarios. One, which is very unlikely, it is the optimistic one, that suppose a policy coordination with all the major economies pushing together to stimulate the economy. This is not happening, and this is very unlikely to happen. It is happening rather the obverse. The baseline and the pessimistic scenario are given more or less the same probability. No, normally the baseline is considered the most likely. Well, this is really not exactly the case. Maybe the most likely will be something in between the baseline and the pessimistic one. The pessimistic one would mean basically that Europe and the United States enter into a recession. No, maybe with only Europe or only the United States, the shock would not be that serious for developing economies and transition economies, but the two of them, yes. And also this pessimistic scenario would have to do with a contagion of a sovereign debt crisis in Europe, affecting the banks, then leading to a credit crunch, and then affecting international trade and prices of commodities. No? And all this also caused to some extent by the fiscal adjustment in developed economies. Now, we are very skeptical here in UNCTAD about the results of fiscal consolidation, or what is called fiscal consolidation. We think that it will not consolidate anything if it is hampering growth as it happens. Then, there is a quantification in this report. You can see that Latin America basically would grow at about 1% in the pessimistic scenario, compared to more or less 3.5% in the baseline scenario. ECLAC is a bit more optimistic. They speak of 3.7 for 2012 in their baseline scenario. So it would be, of course, a strong slowdown, but it would be milder than the one of 2009. No? And also, contraction in the developed economies would be around 1% contraction instead of -3, more or less, no, in 2009. But then this would be the shock. Of course, we may be wrong. Of course, the shock may be more important than that one. But we are supposing that the banks will be rescued so that some contention on the financial side would be provided. But let's see Latin America in the long run. In blue, you have the GDP per capita at constant dollars, 2000. And you can see that, well, two big things, no? That in the 1980s, with the debt crisis and the Washington Consensus, we had a long parenthesis, no? A long moment without significant growth until 2003. And then we recover growth in the region. And the 2009 recession did not broke this trend. And maybe more significant is what happened with the investment rate, no? In which, well, it was around 20% of GDP. This is the gross fixed capital formation, with an acceleration in the 70s, and then the big fall, no? With the debt crisis that did not recover in the 1990s, despite the easy access to fresh capital. But it is recovering now, no? To about 23%. It is not extraordinarily high, but in a comparison, in a historical comparison, it is already a remarkable achievement. Is this happening in a very unstable macroeconomic framework? No. You have the inflation, here the CPI action changes, December to December. It is at about 6.8% in 2011. And well, we had, of course, this is completely new in the recent history in Latin America. We used to have 3 and even 4-digit inflation. These are figures weighted by population. Then, of course, here the big fall in 1994 has to do with the Plano Real in Brazil. And the unemployment rate also we have a steady diminution since the early 2000s. Government. Well, we see also a relatively positive situation. You have the public debt. No, this is the left axis that is at below 40% of GDP. This increase during the crisis is basically due to an increase of public debt in Brazil and Mexico, Venezuela, were the three that explain this increase, but it is not, it is something contained at a relatively low level in historical terms. The fiscal balance is at between 1% and 2%, and this is not the primary, this is the overall balance. Primary balance is slightly positive, actually. And this happened not because there was a big restriction in expenditure, but because we had, at the same time, an increase in expenditure and revenues. No? And even after the crisis. This may be the sign of a structural change, because we are adding 8 percentage points of GDP, between 7 and 8 percentage points of GDP in less than 10 years, as the size of the government, let's say. The role of governments in this region has increased. And if you watch at the composition of the expenditure, interest rates are going down, investment, social transfer are going up. So these are elements that help dynamizing the dynamics of the economy on the supply and the demand side. We do not see either a foreign restriction, an evident one at least. You have the external debt in yellow as a percentage of GDP. It is below 20% of GDP, compared with more than 50% in the 80s. As a percentage of exports of goods, it went down from more than 400% to about 100%, so that you could pay all the external debt, public and private, with the exports of 1 year only. And the current account balance is not completely equilibrated, but at a quite reasonable level of minus 1.4 in 2011. Of course, this is partly explained, not only, but to a large extent explained by the terms of trade that improved basically in South America, not in Central America. In Mexico, it has been more or less flat. And this is happening also with a change in the income distribution, which had deteriorated in an already unequal region during the 80s until the early 2000s, and now is being reduced. Of course, it remains at a relatively high level, but this shows a trend, and this is explained by lower unemployment, by more formal share of formal employment in total employment, recovery of real wages,